I've always thought of Bridgewood as the kind of place where life never truly changes. It's the sort of small town tucked into the rolling fields of the Midwest, a patchwork of farmland and dusty highways, with a single traffic light on Main Street that's more of a courtesy than a necessity. For most of my childhood and, honestly, for most of my adult life, Bridgewood seemed stuck in time. Neighbors still wave from their front porches. Local coffee shops serve the same cinnamon rolls they did 20 years ago. Seniors gather on the benches outside the courthouse on Sunday afternoons. Yet, in subtle ways, my life has been in constant flux here, especially when it comes to love and the way people around me deal with the fact that mine doesn't look like theirs. My name is Adam Pierce. I am 29 years old, an English teacher at our local high school, and I am married to a man named Nick. We tied the knot 3 years ago, not long after same-sex marriage became legally recognized across the country. If you asked me back then how I thought marriage would go, I might have told you it would be a mix of domestic normalcy, cooking together, paying bills, keeping up with car repairs, and the occasional drama that creeps into every relationship. Sometimes I'd even fantasize about the day Nick and I might move to a bigger city where we wouldn't be the talk of the neighborhood. But life rarely turns out exactly how you picture it. For the most part, Bridgewood has left us alone. We're not the first gay couple in town, nor are we the only LGBTQIA1 folks here. But here is something about being a male couple, especially in a mostly conservative Midwestern community, that feels like you are existing behind a glass pane. People see you, but they're not quite sure how to talk to you. Some neighbors have become good friends, smiling and asking about Nick's day at the clinic where he works as a paramedic. Others keep their distance with a polite stiffness that never quite disappears from their eyes. Over time, you learn to read the signals. A nod that says, "I am okay with this." A half smile that says, "I am curious but uncomfortable," or a downright frown that screams, "I don't approve." Nick and I bought a modest 2-bedroom house on Orchard Lane shortly after our wedding. Orchard Lane got its name back in the 1940s, when an apple orchard stretched behind the row of houses. The orchard is long gone, replaced by overgrown grass and a vacant lot used by local teens for secret bonfires. Our house might not be much to look at, faded yellow siding and a roof that needs fixing before winter sets in, but it's ours, and that means something. We even have a tiny garden in the back where Nick has tried to grow tomatoes, cucumbers, and once, to my horror, kale. It turns out neither of us actually likes kale, but it sure sprouted like a weed. Life rolled along quietly enough. My routine was fairly predictable. I'd wake up, brew coffee, drive my pickup to Bridgewood High, teach literature to a bunch of bored but well-meaning juniors, then return home to fix dinner, or enjoy a lazy evening with Nick, assuming he didn't have an overnight shift. Yes, we'd argue about who should do the dishes and whether or not we should adopt a dog. I am allergic, so that's been a big no for me. Yes, we'd have disagreements about whether we should attend pride events in the nearby city, or whether I should reconnect with my parents after they disowned me for being bisexual. But all things considered, it was a life I cherished. That was before I got the text message, a single line that would haunt me for days, penned by a name I hadn't seen light up my phone in years. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, right before first period. My phone buzzed inside my desk drawer. Normally, I'd ignore it. My priority is to greet the kids trickling into the classroom, making sure no one's messing around in the hallway. But that morning, I had an odd sense that I should glance at it. It was just a feeling, and so I did. The display showed a short message from a number that I still recognized by heart. "Hey, I am coming back to Bridgewood. I'd like to see you." My heart lurched so abruptly that I nearly dropped the phone. Zach, my ex-boyfriend. The name alone carried more weight than I was prepared to handle at 7:45 a.m. I hadn't spoken to him since the day he left Bridgewood, nearly 5 years ago. Right around the time I'd started thinking about coming out to my parents. But that's another story, one riddled with heartbreak and confusion. Back then, Zach and I had been the only openly bisexual guys in our town, or so we'd believed. To be fair, he never actually labeled himself, though he dated both men and women. In Bridgewood, those labels tend to stick no matter how loudly you might try to disclaim them. We met at a book club organized by the local library, of all places. He was reading Vonnegut. I was pretending to read Dickens. Sparks flew quickly, too quickly maybe. Within a year, we were convinced we had something special, though we knew better than to flaunt it. We'd sneak around, meeting in places we hoped no one would notice. The abandoned orchard, the deserted bleachers, behind the high school's football field, or the back booth of the one diner that stayed open late on Fridays. Looking back, it was a whirlwind of secret kisses and urgent confessions. Then, as fast as it all ignited, it ended. Zach left one afternoon, telling me he couldn't breathe here, that Bridgewood was suffocating him. He never mentioned the possibility of me going with him, and I suppose, at the time, I was too scared to say yes if he had. The final conversation we had was heated, full of accusations and half-truths. I told him he was selfish for leaving. He told me I was cowardly for staying. A week later, I saw him packing up his car near the old orchard. He didn't even say goodbye. After that, he was just Ganino calls. No texts, nothing. I hurt for months, maybe years. Then I met Nick, and a different kind of life opened up. We built our life together on Orchard Lane, ironically near the same orchard that once served as Zach's and my secret refuge. In the years that followed, I tried not to think about Zach. I never reached out, and he never came back. Until now, I told myself I should delete the message. I was married, after all, and I'd made my peace, or so I thought. But the moment I saw that Z signature, an entire wave of old feelings resurfaced. Part of me felt fear. Part of me felt anger. But beneath all of that was a pang of curiosity, a question that wouldn't go away. Why now? Mr. Pierce? You okay? Mason, one of my 11th graders, had stepped into the classroom and apparently caught me staring wide-eyed at my phone. I glanced up, swallowing the tension in my throat. Yeah, I am fine, I managed, sliding the phone into my pocket. Just got some unexpected news, but everything's okay. Mason nodded, like he wasn't entirely convinced, but he kept quiet. The kids filed in, and I tried to steady my nerves as I launched into a discussion about The Great Gatsby. We were covering Chapter 5, where Gatsby's reunion with Daisy sets the stage for everything that unfolds afterward. Oddly enough, talking about old loves coming back to the forefront hit much closer to home than I cared to admit. Throughout the day, I wrestled with my own thoughts. Should I tell Nick about the text? Should I respond to Zach at all? A sense of guilt started to tighten around my chest. I wasn't doing anything wrong simply by receiving a message, but it felt like a betrayal to keep it from my husband. Then again, Nick and Zach had never met, and I wasn't exactly eager to bring up old stories. By the time I pulled into our driveway that evening, the sun had dipped behind the line of oak trees that separated our yard from the vacant lot. Nick's Jeep was already there, meaning he'd beaten me home. That was unusual. He often worked late at the clinic or took night shifts on the ambulance. I found him in the kitchen, rummaging through cupboards. "Hey, babe," he greeted, throwing me a bright, easy smile. "I was thinking burgers for dinner. We have some ground beef from last week, if it hasn't gone bad. How was your day?" I set my messenger bag down on the table, forcing a smile in return. Nick, with his sandy brown hair and gentle gray eyes, was the epitome of warmth and stability. I loved him. And yet, here I was, torn up inside about a single text. "Burgers sound good," I said quietly. Day was surprising. He picked up on my tone immediately. Nick was always attuned to my moods. He abandoned his search of the cupboards and turned to face me, arms folded. "Want to talk about it?" A part of me desperately wanted to say, "Yes, I got a text from Zach." But I couldn't form the words just yet. Instead, I mumbled something about a tough day at school, referencing a student who'd been caught plagiarizing. Nick's eyes lingered on me. He knew I was holding back, but he let it slide. "You sure you are okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, stepping forward to plant a quick kiss on his cheek, hoping to quell his concern. "I am all right. Let's do burgers. Maybe open a bottle of that cheap wine and watch something ridiculous on television." Nick grinned. "Deal." The evening passed in a comfortable lull. We ate, we teased each other about the incompetent judge on some cooking competition show, and we retreated to bed earlier than usual. In the darkness of our bedroom, the hush of the neighborhood outside our window felt overwhelming. I couldn't sleep. My mind was an endless reel of the possibilities Zach's reappearance might bring. While Nick breathed steadily beside me, I stared at the ceiling, remembering how Zach used to joke about the freckles on my shoulders, how he'd traced them like constellations. I remembered the smell of his favorite leather jacket. And the fights. God. The fight swords flung like knives, accusations that cut deep, scarring both of us. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, my alarm was blaring. As I dragged myself through the motions of the morning shower, coffee, checking the weather, I realized I needed to decide what to do about the text. A voice inside my head urged me. You can't just ignore him. Another part of me insisted. This is a bad idea. Move on. I couldn't reconcile those two voices, so I shoved my phone into my pocket and headed to school. Yet, Zach's message nagged at me. My instincts told me that he wouldn't text without a reason. He'd made a clean break all those years ago. What had changed? Why come back now? During my free period, I found myself sitting at my desk, staring at that unanswered text. My thumb hovered over the screen. At last I typed a curt reply. I am surprised to hear from you. When are you coming? And why? I hesitated a moment before hitting send, but then it was done, out of my hands. The response came during lunch, my phone vibrating amid the dull chatter of the teacher's lounge. I glanced around, making sure no one was reading over my shoulder. Most of the staff were too preoccupied with their sandwiches or gossip about upcoming budget cuts. Quickly, I checked Zach's message. Flying in Friday afternoon. My dad's sick, and I have to handle some family stuff. Not sure how long I'll stay. I just want to see you, if that's okay. His dad. I remembered Mr. Parker, a tall, stoic man who ran a small engine repair shop on the outskirts of town. He'd never quite approved of Zach's choices, and by extension, he'd never approved of me. The man once told Zach that he was wrong in the eyes of God, or so Zach confided late one night. I felt a tightness in my chest, a pang of sympathy or sadness. I wasn't sure which. I typed back. I am sorry. Hope he recovers soon. I am married now, Zach. I am not sure meeting is a good idea. I stared at those words, a painful lump forming in my throat. It was true. I was a married man, committed, and I meant those vows with all my heart. Still, my finger trembled before I pressed send. A flicker of guilt lit up in my chest, overshadowed by something I couldn't quite name, maybe the ghost of an old longing. Within seconds, I saw the little bubble appear, indicating Zach was typing a reply. I forced myself to drop the phone face down on the table, reminding myself I was in the lounge. My colleagues, Miss Henson and Mr. Walters, were in the corner dissecting the latest staff meeting fiasco. I didn't need them seeing the strain on my face. A minute later, I mustered the nerve to check Zach's message. I know you are married. I am not trying to sabotage anything. Just want to talk, catch up. I'll be in town for a while. If you change your mind, you know where to find me. He didn't mention where he'd be staying, but in Bridgewood, there weren't many options. If he wasn't bunking with his father, he'd likely take a room at the old Willow Inn near the highway, or possibly that rundown motel that offered weekly rates. My mind conjured 100 scenarios, each one more complicated than the last. For the next couple of days, I attempted to lock my thoughts of Zach away in some mental vault. I focused on teaching, grading papers, and supporting Nick through his busy schedule. But at odd moments, like when I opened the fridge to grab milk, or when I drove past the orchard on my way home, I'd find my mind drifting back. Each time, I'd push the memories away, reminding myself that life had changed, that I was no longer that uncertain boy who'd let Zach define how I felt about myself. On Thursday night, Nick and I had plans to meet a few friends for dinner at the local diner. The place was a classic neon sign flickering, Michelle's Diner in pink script, vinyl booths, and a jukebox that croaked out golden oldies. We slid into a booth next to our friends Harper and Mike, a married couple from a few blocks over. As we chatted about mundane local drama, apparently someone's dog had run amok in the supermarket. My eyes kept wandering to the front windows, scanning for a face that wasn't there. Adam, you're spaced out, Harper teased, breaking my reverie. What's got you so jumpy? I managed a light laugh. Just tired. Long week at school. Nick shot me a concerned look from across the table, but Harper and Mike took my explanation at face value and moved on, joking about upcoming Halloween events in town. I sipped my iced tea, trying to banish the swirl of emotions that kept surfacing. When the check arrived, Nick reached over and laid his hand on mine. His expression was gentle, worried. Adam, everything okay? Really? He asked in a near whisper. Mindful of Harper and Mike discussing something else, I swallowed, giving him the best reassuring smile I could muster. I am fine. Let's head home. On the drive back, Nick was quiet, and I didn't offer any explanations. The moon was out, illuminating the farmland that stretched away from the narrow road. There was a hush to the night, a stillness that made me feel uneasy, as though the entire town was holding its breath. It reminded me of how I felt inside, coiled tight, anticipating something I wasn't sure I wanted. When I woke on Friday, a buzzing in the back of my mind kept reminding me, Zach arrives today. I lingered in the shower, letting the hot water pummel my shoulders, hoping it might wash away the tension knotted between my shoulder blades. It didn't. I felt an unspoken weight each time Nick looked at me, concerned. A pit of guilt formed in my stomach, because I knew I should tell him. This was important, whether or not it ever went anywhere. At breakfast, I decided to try. "Hey, Nick," I ventured, summoning up my courage. He was dressed in his dark blue uniform polo, coffee mug in hand. "I have something I need to." His phone rang, a shrill tone that made both of us jump. He gave me an apologetic look, checking the caller ID. "It's the clinic. I need to take this." I nodded, feeling an odd mix of relief and disappointment. He stepped into the living room while I scooped cereal into my bowl, my appetite non-existent. I heard him wrap up the call. Apparently someone had called in sick, and Nick was needed earlier than usual. He walked back in, lips pressed in a thin line. "I have to leave now, sorry," he said, setting his mug down. "What were you going to say?" "Oh, just that I might be a bit late after school. I have some errands to run," I lied, or at least half lied. If I chose to see Zach, that could qualify as an errand. Nick offered a regretful smile, brushing his lips across my cheek. "We'll talk tonight, okay?" "Love you too," I murmured, watching him grab his keys and head out. I stood there for a long minute, the milk in my bowl turning my cereal soggy. It felt as though the day was set on a collision course I could no longer avoid. Zach was arriving sometime that afternoon, if he hadn't already landed, and I still hadn't decided if I was going to see. At school, the day crawled by with agonizing slowness. When the final bell rang, I gathered my things methodically, trying to suppress the pounding in my chest. The hallways emptied of students, replaced by an echo of footsteps and the distant hum of fluorescent light. Eventually, I found myself in the parking lot, sitting behind the wheel of my pickup, staring at I typed a single line to Zach. "Where are you staying?" Then I clicked send. His reply came almost immediately. "Willow Inn. Room 14. I'll be here all evening." The Willow Inn. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My mind was already spinning with questions I had no answers for. Why did I text? Why couldn't I just go home and wait for Nick? But I knew the answer. Something inside me couldn't rest until I faced Zach, until I saw him with my own eyes and made sense of why he'd reached. So I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. On the short drive across town, every street seemed so familiar I felt like I was seeing them through a haze. The evening sun was sinking lower, bathing the houses and storefronts in a soft orange glow. People were out walking dogs or chatting on porches. A few recognized my truck, giving a friendly wave. I waved back absent. 10 minutes later, I found myself outside the Willow Inn, a squat, single-story building that boasted a modest sign with a cursive W, entwined with vine-like decoration. The parking lot was half empty. Room 14 was on the far end. I sat in the driver's seat, my heart beating hard enough to rattle my memories crashed over me. The first time Zach and I kissed behind the high school gym, the way his eyes lit up when he teased me about my taste in music, the sting of him leaving without. This is stupid, I thought. You are married. You should just turn around. But I did. I killed the engine and climbed out. The gravel crunched under my feet, loud in the quiet of the early evening. My pulse hammered with each step. When I reached the door marked 14, I lifted my fist to knock. My hand trembled. For a moment, I considered walking away, but before I could decide, the door swung open. There he was. He looked different, older, sharper around the edges. His hair was shorter than I remembered, no longer the tousled waves he used to sport, and faint lines creased the corners of his hazel eye. But there was no mistaking that face, those same eyes that had once looked at me with a mixture of daring and. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. "Hey," he said, voice low. "I wasn't sure you'd actually." I stepped into the room, my heart still pounding like a drum in my ears. The scent of musty carpet and cheap motel soap enveloped me. The space was dim, lit only by a single bedside lamp. A suitcase lay half open on the bed. Zach closed the door, and suddenly, the hush between us felt too thick to. I cleared my throat. "Hey," I managed, folding my arms over my chest, unsure what to do with my body. "So, you are back. How's your day?" Zach shrugged, running a hand through his short. "He's stable, for now. They're keeping him in the hospital for a few more days. Kidney issues. I am here to handle some paperwork. And, well, I nodded, uncertain how to respond. My gaze roamed the small room, looking for a safe focal point. It landed on a battered notebook perched on the nightstand. Zach always kept it. "So, how have you been?" he asked quietly, shifting on his. "Good," I replied too quickly. I realized I sounded guarded, and maybe I was. "I am teaching English at the high school. I am married to Nick. 3 years, next month." Zach's lips twitched into something akin to a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," I heard. "Congratulations." I wanted to ask who told him or how he found out, but I bit my tongue. Small towns had a way of circulating news, even across state lines. Besides, it didn't matter. Silence settled in again. The air felt heavy with everything unspoken: anger, regret, 1,000 things we'd left unresolved when he drove away 5 years ago. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, wanting to fill the quiet but terrified of what might spill. Finally, Zach inhaled, his chest rising, before saying, "I know this must be weird for you. It is for me too. But I needed to come back. And I wanted to see you, Adam." A flurry of emotions swirled in my chest, part relief, part anxiety, part an echo of what we once had. I forced myself to stand firm. "Why?" I asked, my voice quiet. "You left so abruptly. It hurt, you know. And now you are here, wanting to see me?" "I am not the same guy I was, Zach." His gaze flickered down, as if he couldn't hold my "I am not the same either. I know an apology might be too little, too late. But I am sorry, Adam, for everything. For leaving you like that. For not giving us a chance." My throat tightened. Hearing him say those words out loud cut deeper than I expected. Part of me had longed for that apology, for some acknowledgement of the pain he caused. But now that it was here, it felt overwhelming. I tried to swallow the knot in my throat. I've tried to move on. I did move on. I have a life now, with Nick. We have a home. He lifted his eyes, and for a heartbeat, I saw the same Zach I once loved. Vulnerable, hopeful, scared. "I am not asking you to throw that away," he said, stepping closer. "I just thought maybe we could talk. Properly this time. No secrets." "Secrets," I repeated, letting the word hang in the stale motel air. Yes, we'd had plenty of those, once upon a time. We hid our relationship from neighbors, from certain friends, from families who wouldn't understand. And we hid our fears from each other too, until it all blew apart. I realized I was trembling slightly, my arms crossed to keep myself steady. "You can't just expect me to forget how you disappeared," I whispered, my voice thick. "You can't expect me to let you waltz back in without consequences." Zach nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. I am not here to disrupt your life, Adam. But I also know that bridging the past might be the only way to move forward." His words tugged at something in my chest, a sense of unfinished business. He was right about one thing. I'd never truly dealt with the way he left. I'd buried it under new love, new commitments, and a quiet suburban life. And now, here he stood, threatening to tear open old wounds. I let out a long breath, trying to steady the tumult of emotions. Outside, a car door slammed in the parking lot, momentarily pulling my attention to the window. It was dusk. The sky behind the motel's neon sign was streaked with pink and purple. Turning back, I found Zach watching me with an intensity that felt both familiar and unsettling. "Okay," I said, my voice quavering. "We can talk. But don't expect me to drop everything, especially not my marriage. Nick's my family now." "I understand," Zach murmured. "And I don't want to cause problems for you two. Just meet me tomorrow, maybe at the old diner, if that's not too awkward. We can have breakfast, talk about everything." My heart thundered in my chest, pounding out an erratic rhythm. A part of me screamed, "No, this is a bad idea." Another part whispered, "You need closure." Finally, I nodded. "Okay. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m., Michelle's Diner. But that's it for now. Zach exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath. Thank you, he said softly. With that, I turned toward the door. My hand was on the knob when his voice stopped me one last time. I paused, not looking back. Yeah, I am really sorry, he said again, the words trembling with sincerity. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on it. I know, I managed. Then I stepped out into the parking lot, letting the door click shut. Standing under the neon glow of the Willow Inn sign, I inhaled the cool night air, trying to calm the tempest inside my head. This was just the beginning, I realized. Zach might have opened a door to the past that was safer left locked. And yet, some part of me recognized that maybe it was time. Maybe I couldn't keep ignoring the memories, the pain, the leftover questions. But what would this mean for me and Nick? I dreaded the thought of hurting him, of betraying his trust. He deserved honesty, and I owed it to him to be upfront. My stomach churned as I climbed back into my truck. The ignition roared to life, but I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my mind spinning in circles. I glanced at my phone on the passenger seat. No new messages. Nick probably wasn't home yet. Tomorrow I'd face Zach again, this time in public. But how was I going to explain that to my husband? As I drove away from the motel, the sky had deepened into twilight. My headlights cut through the gloom on the empty stretch of highway leading back to Orchard. The houses that lined the road were silent sentinels, their porch lights like distant stars. I felt more alone than there was a knot of dread in my gut, but beneath that, there was also an unsettling flicker of anticipation. Maybe this was exactly what I needed, a chance to lay old ghosts to rest. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that I just stepped into a minefield, uncertain which step would set off an explosion. Tomorrow, I'd look Zach in the eye and try to piece together the shards of our past. But tonight, as I pulled into our driveway and saw that Nick's Jeep wasn't there, all I could think was how fragile everything felt. The orchard behind our house rustled in the wind, the empty field whispering memories of a younger me who once believed in a secret love that could conquer any obstacle. I was no longer that boy. Cutting the engine, I sat in the hush of the cab, staring at the faint glow from the porch light. My wedding ring felt heavy on my finger. In that moment, the stillness of Bridgewood wrapped around me, a silent testament to lives that never stopped moving, even when the town itself seemed stuck in. And all I could do was wonder, had I just made the biggest mistake of my life by walking into room 14 at the Willow Inn? Or was it the first step toward finally burying the past that haunted me? I didn't have an answer. I only knew that my world was shifting again, and this time, it wasn't just my own heart on the line, it was Nick's. And if there was one thing I'd learned from loving Zach, it was that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones you keep from the people you love most. I took a deep breath, opened the truck door, and walked into the house, bracing myself for whatever tomorrow would. I woke on Saturday morning to the sound of birds singing outside our bedroom window. The faint glow of dawn filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the bed. Nick was still asleep beside me, one arm slung across my waist. For a moment, I forgot about everything. Zach, the diner, the knots of worry that had kept me tossing and turning all night. Instead, I focused on the gentle rise and fall of my husband's breathing. But like an alarm bell in the back of my mind, the reality of the day ahead swiftly returned. I glanced at the clock on my phone, 6:37 a.m. In 2.5 hours, I was supposed to meet Zach at Michelle's diner. My stomach twisted at the thought of it. I slid out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Nick, and headed to the bathroom. My reflection in the mirror looked pale and tense, eyes shadowed by a night of restless sleep. I splashed cool water on my face, wishing it could wash away the guilt that clung to me. I still hadn't told Nick about Zach's reappearance. And now, I was about to sneak off to a breakfast meetup with a man I once loved. I braced my hands on the edge of the sink, leaning forward, as though I could somehow press my worries into the porcelain. Why can't I just be honest with him? My reflection offered no answers. A gentle knock came at the door. I jolted upright. Nick's muffled voice followed. "Adam, you okay?" I toweled my face dry and opened the bathroom door. Nick stood there in his rumpled pajamas, hair sticking up in sleepy tufts. His eyes, filled with concern, searched mine. "Couldn't sleep," I said softly, stepping past him. "Too many thoughts in my head." He yawned, blinking away the last traces of slumber. Come back to bed for a bit. I shook my head. Nah, it's almost 7. I was thinking of heading out to do some errands. Errands? On a Saturday? He frowned, confusion and worry pooling in his gaze. You never run errands this early. I forced a casual shrug, avoiding his eyes. Figured I'd get 'em done so we can relax later. He didn't look convinced. For a second, I thought he might press me, but then he simply nodded. All right, let me know if you want me to come with. A pang of guilt tightened in my chest. I swallowed and mustered a smile. No need. I'll be quick. Nick lingered as I walked into the bedroom to get dressed. Adam, he said quietly, if something's on your mind, you can tell me. I hesitated, sock half on, half off. Then I forced another reassuring nod. It's just some personal stuff. I'll fill you in soon, okay? He inhaled as if to insist, but then let it out, smoothing his hand through his hair. All right, he repeated. But don't shut me out. I love you. My heart clenched. I love you too. Within 15 minutes, I was out the door, tossing on a light jacket over my jeans and t-shirt. The air was still cool with morning dew, and the sky had that hazy gold quality of an early summer sunrise. I got in my pickup and pulled out onto the quiet street. As I rolled past my neighbors' houses, each with neatly trimmed lawns and patriotic flags fluttering on porches, I felt my pulse skitter with each rotation of the tires. The drive to Michelle's diner took less than 10 minutes, but I was too keyed up to notice the scenery. My mind whirled with 1,000 scenarios about what Zach and I would say, how I'd explain myself if Nick found out. He will find out, a voice in my head reminded me. Secrets in Bridgewood don't last long. At this early hour, the diner's neon sign was still glowing from the night before, though it looked faded in the daylight. A single row of cars dotted the parking lot, farmers and early risers fueling up on coffee before starting their day. I killed the engine and sat there, debating whether I could still back out. But then, I spotted Zach's car. It was a silver sedan, sporting out-of-state plates. For a moment, I wondered what he'd been up to in the years since he'd left where he'd gone, who he'd been with. Gritting my teeth, I grabbed my keys, stepped out, and headed inside. The bell above the door chimed. Michelle's diner smelled of frying bacon, maple syrup, and cheap coffee. The booths were red vinyl, the floors polished to a shine. An older waitress I recognized stood behind the counter, scribbling on her pad. When she saw me, she gave a polite nod. Morning, Han. Grab a seat anywhere you like, she said, voice crackling from decades of cigarettes. I scanned the booths and found Zach near the back, hunched over a mug of coffee. He looked up as I approached. His expression was cautious, maybe even a little relieved. Hey, he greeted, gesturing for me to sit across from him. Sliding into the booth, I noticed the tightness in his jaw, the faint circles under his eyes. For a moment I recalled how he used to appear so carefree. Apparently, those days were— Morning, I replied, picking up the sticky menu in front of me. Did you order? Just coffee, he said. Figured I'd wait and see if you actually I looked up, meeting his gaze. There was a question there, unspoken. Why did you come if you were so torn up about— Yeah, I muttered, not really answering. My stomach churned, and the idea of eating anything made me queasy. I might just have coffee too. Zach nodded, and we fell into an uneasy silence. Dot meandered over, taking our orders with a curious glance that lingered a moment too long. This was the side effect of small-town living. Everybody wanted to know everyone's business. When she left, Zach cleared his throat. Thanks for coming, he said quietly. I know it can't be easy. I folded my hands on the table, trying to steady my nerves. I am not even sure why I am here, Zach. What is this supposed to accomplish? He exhaled, glancing out the window at the half-empty parking lot. I don't know, he admitted, turning back. I guess closure? Or maybe to see if we could be friends after everything. I just had to know if we could talk without screaming at each other. A faint pang of anger twisted in my gut, reminding me of the pain he'd caused. You drove off without a goodbye. And now you want friendship? My voice was sharper than I intended. I took a breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. That's not how it works. Zach didn't flinch. I deserve that. I know how much I hurt you. But I was hurting too. It felt like Bridgewood was choking me. Everyone had opinions about who I was supposed to be, what I was supposed to do with my life. My dad, especially. He paused, rubbing his temple. And back then, you weren't exactly in a place to come with me. We never really talked about it. It just, and I felt the echoes of old guilt stirring, because he wasn't wrong. I had been terrified of leaving. Yet the sting remained. It wasn't just about me being scared. You left me a note that basically said, I am done. Goodbye. You made that decision alone. Zach's eyes flickered with regret. I did. And if I could go back and handle that differently, he sighed, trailing off. But I can't. Dot returned, dropping off 2 mugs of coffee and a metal pitcher of cream. She shot us a half smile. Let me know if you want anything. We thanked her, and I poured cream into my mug, stirring slowly. Zach cradled his coffee between his hands, gaze intent on. So, you are happy? He asked after a moment, voice subdued. With your husband, I mean. I nodded, forcing conviction into the gesture. I am. Nick and I, we built a life here. It's not perfect, but it's good. A ghost of a smile tugged at Zach's lips. I am glad. I really am. But the sincerity in his eyes unnerved me, and I found myself looking away, guilt twisted in my chest. Why did I feel guilty? Because I'd found happiness where he could. Because I'd replaced him and moved on? None of it made sense, yet it simmered under my skin. I took a sip of coffee, wincing at the bitterness. Is that all this is? A check-in? Because if so, we can call it. Zach shook his head. Tea here is more. Like I said, my dad's not doing well. I have a lot to handle. But I also realized, coming back after so long, that I couldn't do it without trying to patch things up with you. Or at least, see you again. He swallowed, setting his mug down. I've spent years thinking about what happened between us. My stomach fluttered. I tried to focus on the chipped edge of the table. Well, you are seeing me now, I said softly. What do you expect from me, Zach? I am not that kid you left behind. He exhaled. I know. I am not the same either. I am not asking for anything. Not really. I'd just like to be part of your life again, even if it's as an old friend who occasionally says hi in the cereal. A part of me was tempted to say yes, to let him back in, because I hated the weight of anger and regret I'd carried for so long. But another part screamed that this was dangerous territory, especially since I hadn't told Nick yet. I am not sure that's possible, I said at last. Nick doesn't even know you are here. That piece of information lingered in the air. Zach's brow furrowed. You didn't tell him? I shook my head, my voice growing tight. I tried a couple of times, but I just couldn't. I guess I was worried he'd be upset or get the wrong idea. Especially since you and I cut myself off, heat rushing to my face. Zach leaned back, folding his arms. I can understand that. And he studied me, something like sadness flickering in his gaze. But you know this place, how folks talk. He'll find out eventually. I swallowed hard. Silence followed, thick and uneasy. The diner clinked and clattered with the sounds of breakfast plates scraping, silverware clanging, the hiss of the... Dot bustled around taking orders from the early crowd. Finally, Zach cleared his throat. I don't want to come between you and Nick, he said gently. If seeing me is going to wreck your relationship, then maybe it's better I keep my distance. I rubbed my temple, a dull ache forming there. It's not that simple. I need time to figure out what any of this means. I didn't expect you to walk back into my life. He paused, drumming his fingers on the table. Let me know if you decide you want to talk more. I'll be here for a while, dealing with my dad's stuff. No pressure, I nodded, relief and anxiety mingling in my chest. Oh, he reached into his back pocket, pulling out a small slip of paper. Here's my number. In case you, lost the old one or something. I stared at the slip of paper, hesitating, then took it. The digits felt incriminating in my hand. Like a secret, I wasn't sure Thanks, I murmured, folding it and tucking it into my wallet. Zach offered a tentative smile, then slid out of the booth, dropping a few bills on the table for his coffee. Breakfast is on me, he said, stepping aside. I guess I'll see you around. Before I could respond, he turned and walked out. The bell chimed overhead, and just like that, I was alone, coffee going cold in front. I let out a shaky breath. A confusing swirl of emotions churned in me, relief that the meeting was over, lingering resentment for the past, and a weird pang of longing I didn't want to acknowledge. I'd spent years trying to bury those feelings, to channel them into something healthy with Nick. But now they felt raw and exposed. You have to tell Nick. The thought flared in my mind, and I nodded to myself. I couldn't keep this a secret forever. Nick deserved better than that. We trusted each other, at least. We were supposed to. I sipped my coffee, my appetite non-existent. After a minute, I dropped some money to cover my cup, plus a tip, and headed out. The morning sun was fully up now, warming the air. Across the street, a couple of older folks watered flower boxes outside their store. I could practically sense their curious stares as I climbed into my pick. Bridgewood might have changed in small ways, but gossip still traveled faster than anything else. The drive home was a blur. My mind replayed the conversation with Zach, dissecting each sentence. I kept seeing that flicker of hurt in his eyes when he talked about his dad, about everything he'd faced. Anger warred with empathy inside me. I was angry he'd walked away so easily, but I understood how suffocating the town could be, how harshly some families judge. Back at Orchard Lane, I found Nick on the front porch, sipping coffee from his favorite #1 Parandic mug. He squinted at me as I pulled into the drive. There was a tension in his posture that made my heart pound. I cut the engine, climbed out, and forced a shaky smile. "Hey," I called. Nick raised his mug in greeting, but his eyes were wary. "You were gone a while. Everything all right?" I paused at the bottom of the porch steps, trying to quell the pounding in my chest. "Can we talk?" He nodded, moving over to make room for me on the wooden swing seat. The hinges creaked as I settled beside him. A faint breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby oak. I stared at my hands, struggling to find the right words. I didn't want to lie anymore. Nick had always been there for me, unwavering. He deserved the truth. "Tea here is something I need to tell you," I began, my voice. He nodded, setting his mug on the porch railing. "I am listening." I swallowed hard. "Zach's back in town. My ex, from before you and I met. He texted me a few days ago. I went to see him this morning." Nick's gaze darkened, though he didn't interrupt. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "Okay," he said slowly, voice tight with I exhaled, relieved I'd at least pushed the words out. "He left 5 years ago, and I never expected to hear from him again. Now his dad's sick, and he's here to handle some family issues." He reached Alf, wanted to talk. To, I don't know, clear the air, I guess. "I am sorry I didn't tell you earlier. I just didn't know how." Nick's hands pressed together, knuckles whitening. His tone stayed calm, but the tension was unmistakable. "Are you two planning on seeing each other again?" The question stabbed at me. I honestly don't know. He said he wants to be friends, but I told him I am not sure. I didn't promise any. Nick shifted, staring out at the quiet street. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the rocking of the porch swing the only sound. Finally, he spoke. "Why didn't you tell me the minute you got that text?" I bit my lip, shame licking at my insides. "I was scared you'd be upset or think I wanted something with him." "I don't, Nick. It's just unresolved stuff from the past. He hurt me, and part of me wants to tell him off. Another part wants closure. But it's not about rekindling anything. You are my husband." He exhaled, but the line between his eyebrows remained. "You are right, I am. And I want to trust you, Adam. I do. But it's hard not to worry when your ex-boyfriend suddenly shows up and you are sneaking around to meet." Sneaking around stung, but it was accurate. "I am sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I should have been honest from the start." Nick nodded, shoulders tense. "So, what now? Are you planning to keep talking to?" I rubbed my palms together, wishing I had a clear answer. He gave me his number, told me to reach out if I wanted. "I haven't decided yet. If it bothers you, I won't see him. You are more important to me than some old ghost." Nick was quiet for a beat. Then he reached for my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. "I don't want to be the guy who forbids you from doing something. You are allowed to have closure, if that's what you need. But I want to be part of the conversation. I don't like secrets between us. We've come too far." Relief washed through me, mixing with guilt. "I promise, no more secret." He squeezed my hand. "Good. Because if this starts to become something else, I need to know. Don't leave me in the dark." I managed a small, grateful smile. "I won't." We sat there for a while, the tension still palpable, but at least we were talking. Nick's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it, grimaced. "I've got to head to the clinic soon. Another shift. But we'll continue this conversation." "Oh." I nodded. Okay. He stood, leaning down to press a soft kiss to my lips. For a moment, I clung to him, wishing we could freeze time here on our porch, away from Zach and the path. Then he picked up his mug, grabbed his keys, and headed inside to get ready. Alone on the swing, I watched the sunlight creep across our lawn. The day had only just begun, yet I felt drained. Still, a small measure of relief soothed my nerves. At least Nick and I were on the same page. But how long would that peace last if Zach stayed in town, kept wanting to talk, wanting to pull me into old memories? My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I fished it out, half expecting another message from Zach, but it was just a reminder from the school about a staff meeting on Monday. I sighed, leaning back against the swing. A light breeze ruffled the leaves overhead, carrying the faint scent of cut grass. For the first time that morning, I breathed in slowly, letting the tension ease. No more secrets, I reminded myself. As the sun climbed higher, I decided to busy myself with weekend chores, laundry, tidying up the house, and running to the grocery store for a few items we were missing. I thought staying active might distract me from the tumult in my head. At the supermarket, I wound through the aisles, grabbing milk, bread, chicken, and a few other staples. My mind was on autopilot, replaying every word Zach said at the diner, every expression on Nick's face that moment. I was so lost in thought that I nearly crashed my cart into someone turning the corner by the produce section. I looked up, ready to apologize, and froze. It was Zach. Of course it was Zach. He had a small basket on his arm, half filled with random groceries, ramen packets, a couple of apples, a loaf of bread. His eyes widened when he recognized. "Wow," he said, a wary smile crossing his lips. "Bridgewood really hasn't changed. Still only one supermarket." My heart hammered. "Zach," I managed. Huh. He looked just as anxious as me, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. A few patrons walked by, but no one paid us much mind. Maybe that was a small "How's your dad?" I asked, forcing politeness. He shrugged. "No updates yet. Could be out of the hospital next week if all goes well. Until then, I am stuck here." His gaze shifted to the produce. Figured I should get some actual food instead of living off takeout. I nodded, unsure what else to say. A heavy silence loomed. He cleared his throat. "Look, about earlier, I didn't want to push you. If seeing me is too hard, I'll back off." I chewed my lip, thinking of Nick's words. "We can handle this, but no more secrets." "It's complicated," I admitted. "Nick knows you are back now. I told him about breakfast. He's supportive, but wary." Zach nodded slowly, shifting his weight. We stood there, blocking the path to the lettuce and tomatoes. A young mother with a toddler was waiting politely for us to move. We mumbled apologies, stepping aside. When they passed, Zach looked at me, a flicker of something in his eye showed. "Maybe? Do you want to grab a coffee sometime next week? Or is that too soon?" My stomach clenched. Part of me wanted to say yes. Another part feared that continuing contact might ignite old feelings I wasn't ready to confront. "I need to talk to Nick," I said carefully, "but maybe. No promises, okay? I am not trying to lead you on. I just..." He held up a hand, stopping me. "I get it. No pressure." I appreciated his restraint. We stood awkwardly for another second. Then, with a small nod, I maneuvered my cart past him, heart thumping. "Take care, Zach," I said over my shoulder. "You too," he replied, voice quiet. When I returned home, Nick was already gone, a note on the kitchen table. "Had to head to the clinic early. Don't wait up. Probably another late shift. Love you." I stared at his neat handwriting, feeling a pang of longing to see him, to let him ground me. I carried the groceries in, put everything away, and tried to ignore how empty the house felt. I spent the afternoon grading essays, my mind only half engaged. Should I tell Nick I ran into Zach again? Probably, yes, but it might just stir more tension than necessary. Nothing significant happened. We literally just bumped carts, said hello, parted ways. By evening, I was restless, pacing through the living room. I wondered if I should text Nick, maybe ask if he wanted me to bring him dinner at the clinic. But part of me was afraid to come across as clingy, as if I were overcompensating. Eventually, I settled on the couch, mindlessly flipping channels. A local news broadcast droned on about a string of car break-ins. I let the noise wash over me, hoping to drown out my own thoughts. Somewhere around 9 o'clock, headlights flashed across the window Nick's Jeep pulling up outside. I leapt off the couch, relief coursing through me. He came in, weary lines etched across his face, setting his keys on the foyer table. "Long day," he murmured. I hurried over, wrapping my arms around him. He let out a slow breath, hugging me back. That single moment of contact felt like a balm on raw skin. "How was it?" I asked, pulling back enough to search his face. He shrugged. "Busy. A couple of car accidents, some minor injuries. So it goes." Then he studied me. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. I ran into Zach at the supermarket." Nick's gaze didn't waver, though I felt his grip tighten slightly on my waist. "What happened?" "Nothing," I said quickly. "We said hi. He asked if I wanted coffee sometime. I told him I'd check." Nick's lips curved in a hint of a smile wry, but genuine. "You don't need my permission for coffee, Adam. I just want you to keep me." "That's what I am doing," I promised. "I don't even know if I am going." But I told him I wouldn't hide anything anymore. He nodded, pressing a light kiss to my forehead. "Thank you. That means a lot." We stood there in the entryway, fatigue weighing on us both. Despite the tension, there was a warmth in the air, a sense that we were doing our best to navigate this new twist. Nick sighed, stepping away to slip off his jacket. "I am starving. Did you?" I shook my head. "Not really. Just picked at some leftovers. Let me heat something up." "Sure," he agreed, following me into the kitchen. We ended up sharing microwave lasagna at the table, talking in hushed tones about our days. Occasionally, my thoughts drifted back to Zach, how different he'd looked, the sorrow in his voice. But Nick was here, tangible and real. His presence reminded me of everything we'd built together. When we finished, Nick let out a long yawn. "I am about ready to crash." I nodded. "I'll clean up. You go on to." He offered me a grateful smile. "Thanks." Before leaving the kitchen, he paused, turning back to me. "Yeah, if you do decide to see Zach again, maybe I can come too?" His tone was hesitant, searching. "I just want to know who he is, what he means." I swallowed, surprise and relief mingling in my chest. "Okay," I said softly. "If I decide to meet him, you'll be the first to know. And you are welcome to join." Nick nodded, satisfied. Good night." After Nick disappeared into the bedroom, I rinsed off the dishes and set them in the dishwasher. The rhythmic hum of the machine filled the quiet house. Outside, a summer wind whispered through the trees in our yard. My phone buzzed on the counter. My heart jumped, half expecting it to be Zach again. But the screen showed a text from Mason of my students asking about an essay deadline. With a small laugh at my own paranoia, I typed a quick reply, reminding him to finish by Monday. Then I set the phone down, staring at it for a long moment. I could text Zach. I had his number now. But what would I? "Hey, guess what? My husband might want to." That sounded ridiculous, and maybe a little like a confrontation. Yet Nick had a point. If Zach just wanted to talk, why not do it together? A swirl of anxiety filled my gut at the thought of them face to face, but honesty felt better than secret. I flicked the kitchen light off, stepping into the darkened hallway. The faint glow of a nightlight illuminated the path to our bedroom. Each step felt weighted with new questions, new doubt. I paused outside the bedroom door, hearing the soft rustle of sheets, as Nick shifted it. Opening the door quietly, I slipped inside. He was half asleep, one arm draped over the pillow. I changed into pajamas, slid under the covers, and carefully curled up beside him. Almost instinctively, his arm moved to pull me closer. As my head hit the pillow, I listened to his even breathing. I remembered how lost I'd been 5 years ago. Right after Zach left so close, I'd come to letting bitterness consume me. Meeting Nick changed that. Nick had been patient, reassuring me that I was worthy of love and acceptance. We'd worked so hard to build this life together. Now, Zach's return threatened to shake that foundation. But maybe it didn't have to. Maybe facing the past could finally lay old ghosts to rest. Or it could rip open wounds we'd both worked so hard to heal. Beneath the sheets, Nick's warmth was a reminder that I wasn't alone. For the first time all day, a sense of calm rolled over me. I tucked myself against his chest, inhaling the familiar scent of laundry detergent and something uniquely him. No more secrets, I thought again, letting my eyes drift shut. Whatever happens, we face it together. Outside, the night enveloped Bridgewood in a hushed embrace. In the distance, a lone car rumbled down Main Street, headlights briefly flashing across our drawn curtains. Then all was quiet. As I teetered on the edge of sleep, the swirl of worries faded to a low hum, replaced by the steady beat of Nick's heart beneath my ear. I still didn't know what Zach's presence in town would bring, but I held on to the fragile hope that Nick and I were strong enough to weather it. Yes, I'd meet Zach again, maybe with Nick by my side, so we could hash out the remnants of our past. And this time, I wouldn't hide. Because if love had taught me anything, it was that honesty, however difficult, was the only way to keep from drowning in old mistakes. I drifted off, lulled by the warmth of my husband's embrace and the resolve that, come what may, I'd choose truth over secrets. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the weight in my chest told me I hadn't truly rested. Nick's side of the bed was already emptiest. Early shift at the clinic must have called him away before the first light of dawn. A sliver of regret tugged at me for not waking when he did, though I knew he'd probably slipped out quietly to let me sleep. I shuffled into the kitchen, half expecting to find a new note on the table. Instead, there was just the faint aroma of coffee and a stray spoon left near the sink. A pang of longing hit me. The house felt big and hollow without him. No more secrets, I reminded myself for what felt like the 100th time, as if the mantra would keep my life from unraveling. After a quick breakfast, I found myself flitting around the living room like a restless spirit, too jumpy to settle down. My thoughts kept drifting to Zach. I kept replaying his face from the diner, from the grocery store aisle, the quiet longing in his eyes, the way he seemed both apologetic and hopeful. Nick and I had agreed on honesty, and that meant I needed to tell him if I saw Zach again. But should I see Zach again? Part of me was convinced we needed a real conversation, with Nick present, to clear the air once and for all. Another part feared that inviting Zach into our shared space might only heighten the tension. By late morning, I couldn't handle the inactivity any longer. I threw on shoes, grabbed my keys, and headed out. If nothing else, I could pick up lunch for Nick and bring it by the clinic, an excuse to see him and talk things through. The drive was short, our local clinic sitting on a modest corner of Bridgewood's single main road. A squat brick building, it housed an urgent care unit and a few offices for general practitioners and paramedics like Nick. Pulling into the lot, I spotted his Jeep in the back. Inside, the waiting room was quiet for a Saturday, with only a couple of patients flipping through outdated magazines. The receptionist recognized me with a friendly wave. "Is Nick Pierce free?" I asked softly, not wanting to disturb it. She tilted her head. "He's on break for a few minutes, I think. Go on back." I navigated the short hallway, past a row of closed exam room doors, until I found the small staff lounge. Nick was there by the coffee maker, eyes tired as he watched the last of the brew drip into the... He glanced up at my approach, a smile tugging at his lips. "Hey, you, this is a nice surprise." I held up a paper bag. "Figured you might be hungry." Grabbed a couple of turkey sandwiches from that new deli on Oak Street. Nick's eyes lit with gratitude. "Thanks. You read my mind." We settled at a small table near the window, unwrapping the sandwiches. An awkward hush lingered for a moment. I knew we were both thinking about Zach. Finally, I cleared my throat. "So, any news on your schedule tonight? Are you..." Nick nodded. "I finish up around 5. Unless T here's an emergency, I should be home for dinner." He took a bite, then added, "How are you feeling about everything?" The question was gentle, but it held weight. I rubbed my thumb over the condensation on my soda. "I keep thinking maybe we should all talk together. You, me, Zach. I don't know if that would help, but it might keep the air clear." Nick's expression was guarded. "That's what I suggested, right? I'd rather not have any secrets. If he wants to be in your life, it shouldn't be some hidden side relation." His words stung a little, but I understood where they came from. "I agree," I said softly. "But I am worried it'll be... We have so much history. And you and I, this is our marriage." Nick reached across the table, covering my hand with his. "I trust you, Adam. But I also trust myself to handle it, whatever it is. Just promise me that if you feel torn, you'll come to me first." Emotion tightened my throat. "I promise." A nurse poked her head in then, apologizing for interrupting. "Nick, Miss Avery's asking for..." Nick sighed, standing up and giving my hand a quick squeeze. "Duty calls." "Thank you for lunch, babe. We'll talk more." I nodded. rising to my feet. I felt a flash of gratitude for how level-headed Nick was, how he tried so hard to meet me in the middle despite any jealousy or "See you at home," I said. He kissed my temple and hurried. I headed back to my truck, scanning my phone out of habit. To my surprise, an unknown number had called, leaving a voicemail. My stomach churned. Could it be Zach? But I already had his number saved. I tapped to. A tinny voice crackled. "Hello, this is Bridgewood Medical Center calling for Adam Pierce. This is regarding Gerald Parker's request. If you could please give us a call back at your earliest convenience." The voice continued with some standard contact information. Gerald Parker was Zach's father. A wave of confusion hit me. Why would the hospital be calling me about Zach's death? A second voicemail pinged in. This time, it was an actual voice I recognized. Zach's. He sounded harried, out of breath. "Adam, it's Zach. My dad's insurance paperwork is a mess, and apparently he listed you as an emergency contact a while back. I am trying to handle it, but they asked if you could confirm or sign something. I am sorry to drag you into this, but I am at the hospital now, and he's being moved for more tests. Can you give me a..." My pulse quickened. Why on earth had Mr. Parker put my name as a contact? Maybe it was a mistake from years ago. Zach and I had helped fill out some forms once, but I was sure we'd used Zach's. Still, it sounded like Zach genuinely needed help. This wasn't the kind of scenario you ignore. I climbed into my pickup, dialing Zach's number. He answered on the first. "Adam, hey. I am so sorry about this," he blurted. "I am at Bridgewood Medical right now. The billing folks say here is some confusion with my dad's file, and your name is attached. I have no clue how or why, but they won't let me finalize new paperwork without either his direct consent or the old contact verified." A sigh crackled through the line. "He's stable, but still not great. They're doing another round of dialysis. Look, I am really sorry to pull you in. I can figure it out." "No, it's fine," I interrupted, steering my truck onto the road. "I can be there in 10 minutes. Let me handle it." "Thank you. I'm in room 204. I hung up, heart pounding, and pointed my truck toward the hospital on the other side of town. Bridgewood Medical was a low-slung building with an adjoining wing for long-term care. I hurried through the automated doors, weaving past visitors who clutched flowers and balloons. The interior smelled of antiseptic and cafeteria coffee. At the reception desk, I asked for room 204. The nurse there pointed me down a short corridor, explaining it was a semi-private recovery area. I found Zach pacing in the hallway, arms folded. He stiffened when he saw me, then relaxed slightly, offering a tentative nod. "Adam, how is he?" I asked, glancing at the partially open. Zach exhaled. "He's not thrilled to be in the hospital. He doesn't talk much to me. Blames me for everything, you know. But physically, at least, they want to keep him another few days." "Why am I listed as an emergency contact?" I asked, cutting to the point. A wry laugh escaped his lip. "No clue. Maybe he found an old form from when we were dating and just wrote down the first name he saw. Or it could be something else. My dad's always been stubborn and weird about documentation." My stomach tightened at the thought of Mr. Parker, who had once all but spat in my face for corrupting his son. If he was now inadvertently relying on me for help, that was ironic and a bit surreal. Zach rubbed the back of his neck. "The billing office is down the hall. They said you'd need to sign a statement confirming you are not actually responsible for anything. Then I can be the main contact." I nodded. "Lead the..." He guided me to a small administrative area where a woman in a maroon blazer sat behind a computer, typing away. She looked up as we approached. "Are you Mr. Pierce?" she asked. "That's me," I confirmed. She handed over a clipboard with some dense forms. "Sign and date here and here to formally remove you from Gerald Parker's contact list. We'll update our system accordingly. Sorry for the inconvenience." I scribbled my signature, not missing the tension in Zach's posture as he hovered behind me. Once done, I pushed the clipboard back. The woman nodded in thanks, telling Zach he was now the primary contact. As we turned to leave, Zach's shoulders slumped with relief. "Thank you so much. I owe you." I forced a half smile. "No problem. You want to check on your dad before I..." He paused, shifting on his feet. "I do. But it'll be awkward. You want to come?" Maybe if he sees you, he'll back off on the..." I blinked. I doubt it. He was never fond of me. "You sure that's a good idea?" Zach's mouth twisted. "Not entirely. But maybe you can just say hi. I don't know. I am throwing darts in the dark." A swirl of old anxiety knotted in my chest, remembering how Mr. Parker had looked at me with thinly veiled disgust. Still, if Zach wanted moral support, maybe I could manage a brief. Okay, I relented. But if he starts in on me, I am. Zach nodded, guiding me down the hall to room 204. We slipped inside. A curtain divided the semi-private space, so we only had half a room to navigate. Miss Parker lay in the bed, hooked to various monitors and an IV drip. The beep of medical equipment filled the air. He turned his head slightly as we approached, scowling when he recognized Zach. Back already? Zach swallowed. Dad, I brought Adam? You remember? Mr. Parker's gaze cut to me, dark and full of old anger. He looked thinner, older, with hollow cheeks and a pallid complexion. I remember, he muttered. The one who... He coughed, cutting off the word. I forced a polite nod. Hello, Mr. Parker. Glad to see you are stable. His eyes flicked over me, then he turned away, dismissing me in a silent rebuke. Zach exhaled, glancing at me apologetically. I just shrugged. I'd expected worse, to be honest. How are you feeling, Dad? Zach tried, voice subdued. Mr. Parker coughed again, looking at his son with open resentment. I feel like I am stuck in a damn hospital bed. How do you think I feel? Zach pressed his lips together. Right. Well, I am taking care of the insurance stuff. Don't worry. A bitter laugh escaped Mr. Parker. Oh, I am sure the two of you worked it out. Must be nice to have help from. He cast me another dark. I stepped back. I'll wait in the hall, Zach, I muttered. Feel better, Mr. Parker. No response came. I hurried out, my pulse rattling. If Zach wanted to mend things with his father, it didn't look promising. A minute later, Zach emerged, looking defeated. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to put you... I offered a small shrug. He's your dad. I get. He's never going to understand, Zach muttered, shoving his hands in his pockets. All these years, and he still hates everything about my life. I hesitated, remembering how Nick's parents had eventually come around when we got married, even though it took time. Sometimes people change, I said, trying to be gentle, but maybe he's too set in his way. Zach sighed, letting the moment pass. We walked together down the corridor, heading for the exit. Outside, the afternoon sunlight felt harsh compared to the fluorescent glow in... Thanks again, Adam, Zach said, voice low. I really appreciate you dealing with that. I know it's not easy. It's all right, I replied, searching his face. Are you okay? I mean, you've got a lot on your shoulders right now. He huffed a short laugh. Yeah, well, I'll manage. I always... An awkward silence settled. The glint of sun off a parked car caught my eye, momentarily blinding me. I squinted, stepping aside. Listen, I began. Nick and I were talking. If you want to meet properly, maybe we can do coffee or something, all three of us. Just to be transparent. Zach's eyebrows lifted in mild surprise. All three, I nodded. We're married, you know, no secrets. Nick wants to meet you, to see, I guess, what this is all about. Zach scratched the back of his head. That's probably fair. Might be awkward, but sure. If he's okay with it, I am... A wave of relief stirred in my chest, mixed with nerves. I'll let you know when. Need to coordinate schedule. He nodded, then reached for his car keys. All right, I'll be around. We parted ways, and I walked to my truck, my heart fluttering with a mixture of dread and anticipation. That evening, Nick arrived home around 6. I tried to distract myself by cooking dinner spaghetti and garlic bread, though I was hardly a master chef. He walked in just as I was straining the pot. You are cooking? He teased, hanging his jacket. That's either a sign of the apocalypse or you are trying to impress. I rolled my eyes, smiling. Hey, I can boil pasta. But yeah, let's call it an olive branch in case our conversation gets... Nick's face grew serious. I nodded. I had an unexpected run-in at the hospital. Long story short, his dad had me listed as an emergency contact. I had to sign some paper. Then I told Zach we could all meet for coffee if you are still up for that. Nick raised his eyebrows. I see. So how did that go, seeing him again? I recounted the events, Mr. Parker's hostility, Zach's frustration, the plan for a potential meetup. Nick listened quietly, leaning against the counter, arms full. When I finished, he sighed. I am sorry his dad's being a jerk. But I am glad you stood your ground. I served up the pasta, and we sat down at the small dining table. The overhead light cast a warm glow, emphasizing the tension on Nick's feature. We ate in silence for a few moments, each lost in Finally, Nick set his fork down. Okay, let's do it. Let's meet him. Better to get everything out in the open than let it fester. Relief coursed through me. He nodded. Yeah, if he's going to be around for a while, we might as well address it head on. A hint of gratitude welled up in me. Thank you, I said softly. Nick reached across the table, squeezing my hand. We'll figure this out, together. We arranged to meet Zach the next afternoon at Michelle's diner, perhaps, a symbolic place, given that was where Zach and I had first attempted to talk. The hours leading up to it felt like I was stepping onto a stage for a play I hadn't rehearsed. Nick was tense but composed, and I was a bundle of nerves. When we arrived, Zach was already seated in a booth near the windows, drumming his fingers anxiously on the tabletop. He stood when he saw us, a polite gesture. I felt Nick stiffen beside me, though he quickly extended a hand. Zach, right? Nick said, voice calm. I'm Nick Pierce. Zach shook his hand, managing a faint smile. Good to meet you. Well, formally, I guess. We slid into the booth, Nick and I on one side, Zach on the other. My heart pounded at the arrangement. The physical symbolism of my husband and me, sitting together across from my Dot, the waitress, appeared with her notepad, eyeing our trio with open curiosity. So, 3 coffees? She gasped. We all nodded. When she left, a heavy silence settled. Eventually, Nick cleared his. So, he started. I wanted to meet you in person, since Adam and I are partners in everything. He's told me a bit about your history. Zach shifted, folding his arms. Right. I get it. This is weird, and I am sorry if I've caused trouble. Nick held his gaze. Is that your intention? To cause trouble? Zach's cheeks reddened. No, sir. Sorry. That sounded formal. But no, I am not here to break you two up, or anything dramatic like. Adam and I had some unresolved issues from the past, and now I am dealing with my dad's illness. It brought me back to Bridgewood. Nick nodded slowly. All right, I appreciate the honesty. I could practically hear the tension crackling in the air. Dot came back with steaming mugs of coffee, setting them down gently before bustling. Zach added sugar, stirring in a deliberate, nervous manner. Look, I know how this must look, me showing up out of the blue, but I am glad we're all Nick sipped his coffee, eyes never leaving Zach. Same. If Adam finds closure from this, I am okay with that. I just want to make sure T here is no misunderstanding. Adam and I were Zach shot me a small glance, then looked back at Nick. I am not questioning your marriage. I know you guys have built a life here. I respect. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Good. So maybe we can just figure out how to coexist, yeah? T here is no need for drama. Zach, you are here for your dad, and I was about to say more, but my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced at it. An unknown number. Again. Instinctively, I ignored it, deciding the conversation at hand was more. Nick ran a hand through his hair. So, how long do you think you'll stay in town? Zach shrugged. Depends on Dad's health. If he needs extended care, I might be here a few more weeks. Otherwise, I'll head back to Chicago. Nick nodded. His gaze softened just a fraction. You were. A flicker of tension crossed Zach's face. I was in New York for a while, bartending, but recently moved to Chicago, doing some freelance design, living with a roommate. It's not glamorous, but it's okay. Nick and Zach fell into a stilted back and forth about city life, jobs, and the differences between big city anonymity and small town script. I found myself relaxing at least they were talking. Then my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. I frowned and picked it up, noticing a voicemail icon pop up. I gave Nick an apologetic look. Must be important, I murmured. I'll just listen. Stepping away from the booth, I found a quiet corner by the diner's entrance. The voicemail was from a number in Chicago, maybe something for Zach? Or was it about his... My curiosity piqued. I put the phone to my ear. A brisk female voice played. Hello, Mr. Pierce. This is Linda from Franklin and Associates in Chicago. We're calling regarding the outstanding balance on a shared credit card account. Zachary Park. My blood ran cold. Shared credit card? I listened, stunned, as she continued. We have a record indicating you and Mr. Parker opened this account approximately 4 years. We've been unable to reach him, and we're attempting to collect the overdue balance. I ended the voicemail, heart hammering. 4 years ago, Zach and I had already been broken up for at least a year. We'd never had a shared car. I flicked through my mental memories, coming up blank. Could it be some kind of clerical error? Or identity theft? Or had Zach done something else? Stealing myself, I walked back to the booth. Nick was mid-sentence about something, but he trailed off when he saw my... "What's wrong?" he asked, worry lacing his tone. Zach's gaze darted between us. I set my phone down carefully. "I just got a call from a debt collector in Chicago, saying I have an overdue balance on a shared account with you." Confusion flashed across Zach's face. "That's impossible. I've never opened a joint account." Nick's expression hardened slightly, as though trying to parse the situation. "Are you sure?" Zach frowned, bristling. "Yes, I am sure. Adam and I haven't been together for 5 years. Why would we open a credit card 4 years?" I exhaled, feeling a headache forming. "I don't know. Maybe it's a mistake. But they definitely used your name. And mine." Zach's jaw tight. "I might have started an account with your info once, for something else. But that was before we broke up, like almost 6 years ago. And I canceled it when I left. It shouldn't exist anymore." My stomach churned. Did he use my info illegally? The question roiled in my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to speak it aloud. Nick cleared his throat. "This is complicated. Maybe you two should sort it out private." Zach stared at me, looking genuinely startled. "I honestly have no idea what this is about, Adam. We can call them together, figure it out. I wouldn't do something like that behind your back." I believed he sounded sincere, but suspicion gnawed at me. Haven't we all kept secrets in one form or another? Dot approached, placing our check on the table with a forced grin, clearly noticing the tension. "Whenever you are ready," she said brightly, then hurried off. Nick slid out of the booth, not waiting to finalize who was paying. "I'll cover this," he said, pulling out his wallet. "Adam, maybe you and Zach can talk outside. I'll join you in a sec." I glanced at Zach, who nodded in agreement. Outside, the late afternoon sun felt too warm on my skin. Zach and I moved to the side of the diner, away from a small family who was just entering. "Look," he said, raking a hand through his hair. "I swear I didn't open any new account after leaving Bridgewood. I was broke, sure, but not an idiot." The anger, confusion, and embarrassment in his voice sounded genuine. "Then how do they have my info?" I asked, frustration creeping into my tone. Zach shrugged helplessly. "I don't know. Identity theft is a thing. Or maybe the old account was never fully closed. Let's call them together, see what's on file." Nick emerged then, receipt in hand. He approached cautiously. "Everything okay?" "Just sorting it out," I said, blowing out a breath. "Might be some identity mix-up." Zach exhaled. "I'll find the number. We can call from my phone." We huddled near the diner's wall, Zach dialing the Chicago debt collector and putting it on speaker. A polite but firm representative answered. Zach explained the situation, giving my name as well. The rep read off an address that neither of us recognized, plus a date of birth that was close to mine but off by a month. "It appears your social security numbers partially match," the rep noted. "But the account was opened 4 years ago under Mr. Parker's name, with an Adam Pierce listed as a secondary user." My heart pounded. This is a mistake. I never signed anything. Nick stood there, arms crossed, tension radiating from him as we "Please hold," the rep said, music playing through the tinny phones. Zach looked at me, his eyes earnest. "I am sorry. I don't know what the hell this is." I nodded, still reeling. "We'll figure it," the rep returned, apologizing for the confusion. "It looks like a case of partial identity theft. The account is delinquent, but if you can confirm you never signed, we'll remove your liability. Mr. Parker will remain responsible for the charge." Zach's face went pale. "Me? Responsible? I didn't open it. Sir, our records show you as the primary applicant. If you wish to dispute it, you'll need to file a formal claim for fraud." Zach cursed under his breath. The rep gave instructions to submit documentation, an affidavit, and so forth. Zach scribbled them down on a note. When the call ended, we all stood there, stunned. So some scammer took partial info from both of us, slapped it together, and ran up a bill? I asked, incredulous. Zach's gaze was distant. "Seems like it. But the primary is me, which means they use more of my data than yours. I'll have to..." Nick let out a slow breath. "Well, At least Adam's off the hook. I nodded, relief washing over me, though I felt bad for Zach. He was stuck dealing with a fraudulent debt that could haunt his credit. Zach shoved the notepad in his pocket. I'll sort this out. Sorry it bled into your life. Not your fault, I said gently, exhaustion creeping in. You sure you'll be okay? He nodded, but the strain on his face was obvious. Yeah, dad stuff is enough stress, but guess I'll add this to the... Nick and I exchanged a glance. I could see empathy flicker on my husband's face. Well, if you need help filing those forms, let us know, Nick offered, surprising me. I know it's not easy, especially if your dad's in the hospital. Zach blinked, as if touched by the gesture. Thanks, he said, voice quieter now. I appreciate. A moment of almost camaraderie fell over us. A sense that maybe we were all on the same side against old grudges, fraudulent credit cards, and the messy past. But it was tenuous, and we all felt. Nick and I parted ways with Zach, each of us subdued. Driving home, Nick rested a hand on my knee, eyes on the road. Are you okay? I nodded, just drained. This whole thing is so bizarre. Makes me realize how entangled our pasts can be, even after we think we've moved on. Nick hummed in agreement. Yeah, but I am glad you are not responsible for that. Me too, I said, forcing a small smile. At home, we changed into comfortable clothes. I sat on the couch, and Nick settled beside me, slinging an arm around my shoulder. The television mumbled quietly in the background, but we weren't really watching. So, are you feeling better about Zach now? Nick asked gently. He tilted my head, considering. Weirdly, yes. It's like seeing him vulnerable dealing with his dad. This fraud thing reminds me he's just a person, not some villain. But I still don't know what it all means. Nick's thumb stroked a gentle pattern on my shoulder. It might not mean anything more than closure, Adam. Sometimes, people reappear just so we can tie up loose ends. I turned to him, heart swelling with gratitude. You are amazing, you know. He laughed softly. I am just trying to keep my husband sane. We kissed, a gentle press of lips that felt like a promise of better tomorrows. Then we settled back, letting the moment of calm linger. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in oranges and pinks, casting a warm glow through the window. Eventually, Nick stood. I am starving. Let's order pizza. I grinned, deep. While Nick called in the order, I wandered to the window, gazing at the orchard behind our house. The wind rustled through the trees, as if whispering secrets from the past. I thought of how Zach and I used to hide back there, how everything felt so intense, so urgent. Now, it was different. We were older, battered by reality, each carrying scars. Maybe Nick's right, I mused. Maybe this is just about... But deep down, I wasn't entirely sure. Something told me there were more threads to untangle Zach's father, the resentment that still simmered, the unexplored fragments of our old relationship. For now, though, I had Nick, and we had a quiet moment of peace. As the night pressed in, I decided to hold on to that peace as tightly as I could. There'd be time enough for whatever storms might come next. A crisp autumn wind swept through Bridgewood a few days later, carrying hints of the changing season. The leaves on the old oaks in our backyard had begun to bronze at the edges, and the orchard behind the house whispered in the afternoon sun, a gentle, rustling reminder of all that had happened here. For the first time in a long while, I felt the subtle shift of time in our small Midwestern town, a reminder that nothing stays the same forever. Nick and I had settled into a tentative routine. We didn't tiptoe around the subject of Zach anymore. He'd become a strange fixture of our days since re-entering our lives. We weren't exactly best friends, but we weren't enemies either. Occasionally, Nick asked if I'd heard from Zach, and I gave him honest answers. That honesty, no matter how uncomfortable, seemed to ease the tension. I found myself texting Zach sporadically, mostly about practical things, updates on his father, or the ongoing drama with the fraudulent credit card account. He responded with weary gratitude or dry humor, trying his best to mask the frustration he was feeling. As for Mr. Parker, he was still in the hospital, his kidneys refusing to cooperate, making every day a question mark for Zach. By midweek, Zach sent me a message asking if we could catch up briefly. The credit card mess is getting complicated, he wrote. Could use your help. I didn't hesitate to tell Nick, who simply shrugged and said, if it'll help him straighten out the fraud claim, go for it. Just keep me in. That's how I found myself back at the Willow Inn on a gloomy Thursday evening. The neon sign in the window flickered faintly against the darkening sky, and a solitary street lamp buzzed by the park. My pulse thrummed as I climbed out of my truck. It was the same room 14 where I'd first stood face to face with Zach a couple of weeks ago. Everything and nothing had changed since. Zach opened the door a moment after my knock. He wore a rumpled t-shirt and jeans, circles under his eyes. The musty motel room smelled faintly of takeout and stale coffee. "Hey," he said, stepping aside so I could enter. "Thanks for—" I nodded, my gaze sliding over a small stack of paperwork on the bed. "No problem. Nick knows I am here, just so you are aware." His expression pinched slightly. Then he offered a tired smile. "Glad to hear you two are still being honest with each other. It's a good—" We settled on opposite ends of the bed, the ancient mattress sagging in the middle. On the nightstand sat his open laptop, the screen displaying multiple tabs of legal forms and credit dispute instructions. A half-eaten container of noodles perched precariously near the laptop. "How's Mr. Parker?" I asked, wanting to start there. Zach blew out. "He's stable, but not improving much. They want to move him to a rehab facility if his condition doesn't pick up soon. He still won't really talk to—" His mouth tugged downward. "But I am trying." I fiddled with the zipper on my jacket. He shrugged, the movement stiff. "Anyway, about this credit stuff." He gestured to the form. "I've filed a dispute, but they're demanding more proof that I wasn't the one who signed as you. I don't even know how to prove it." I picked up one of the forms, scanning the lines of legal jargon. "What do they need?" "Just a statement saying we haven't been in contact for years until recently, plus maybe a copy of your ID to show it doesn't match the name or birth date on the fraudulent file." He looked at me, eyebrows knit. "I am sorry. I hate dragging you into all this." "It's okay." I set the form down gently. "I'll help however I can." Zach raked a hand through his hair. "I appreciate it. I just want this over with so I can focus on my—" I nodded, pulling out my phone. "We can write a statement tonight, email it to the company, and I'll attach a scanned ID. Should be straightforward." He exhaled, relief flickering in his eyes. While Zach typed on his laptop, I offered a few suggestions, rechecking the official instructions on the dispute webpage. It almost felt like old times in a bizarre way, Zach and me collaborating on something, shoulders nearly touching as we both stared at. Except, unlike years ago, there was no clandestine thrill, no electric undercurrent of secrecy. Just a weary sense of two people trying to fix a problem. At one point, my phone buzzed, and I glanced at the screen. A text from "Everything okay?" I typed back quickly. "Yes, just paperwork. Home soon." Zach caught the exchange from the corner of his eye. "He's checking on you." I shrugged. "He's worried that—" Zach's gaze lingered on me, something bittersweet in his expression. "He really loves you, does—" My chest tightened. "Yeah, he does," I replied softly. "And I love him. I hope you can respect—" "I do," Zach said at once. "I am not here to undermine your marriage, Adam." He hesitated, lips pressed. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd asked you to come with me back then. Would we have had a—" I glanced away. We'd never directly asked that question, not in so many words. "I don't know," I admitted. "It's too late to change it now. And maybe it was never meant to be." His shoulders slumped. He fiddled with the edge of the blanket. "Yeah, probably." An uncomfortable quiet settled. Finally, Zach closed the laptop with a snap, as if trying to shut that topic out. "We should get these forms printed and sent," he said, standing and grabbing his jacket. "T here is a 24-hour copy place on Elm Street." I stood as well. "Yes, I can swing by and do it on my way." He caught my gaze. "Thank you." I managed a small smile. "Hey, we'll figure." We left room 14, stepping into the motel's dimly lit parking lot. A single street lamp buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the cracked pavement. I was about to say goodbye when Zach's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and I saw his face blank. "It's the hospital," he muttered, swiping to answer. I watched his expression shift from surprise to alarm, then to outright fear. I am on my way," he said, voice tight. He ended the call, eyes meeting. Dad took a turn. "They said they're rushing him to emergency dialysis. He's not—" My stomach dropped. "I'll drive." Zach didn't argue. We hopped into my pickup, and I tore out of the parking lot, tires squealing against the damp asphalt. Adrenaline surged as we sped through Bridgewood's sleepy street. The hospital's lights came into view all too soon. Zach's knee bounced nervously. My own nerves crackled with— We parked haphazardly near the emergency entrance. Zach bolted inside while I followed close behind. The reception nurse pointed us to the ICU. There, a doctor in scrubs stood near a cluster of monitors, talking with another nurse. Zach rushed up, breathless. "Dr. Glenn?" he panted. "How?" The doctor eyed Zach sympathetic. "We managed to stabilize your father's blood pressure, but his kidney function is almost non-existent now. Dialysis is helping, but he's very..." She glanced at me, then back at... "He's been in and out of consciousness. You can see him, but only briefly." Zach's face tightened. "Thank you," he was. Dr. Glenn nodded and stepped aside. Zach turned to me, the strain on his features heartbreaking. "Adam, can you wait here? I need to see him. Alone." I squeezed his arm in solidarity. "Of course." He disappeared behind a set of double doors, leaving me standing in the sterile hallway, the rhythmic beep of machines and the pungent smell of disinfectant pressed against my senses. I exhaled shakily, remembering how Nick dealt with this environment daily. A wave of respect for him and for everyone who worked in medicine washed over. Minutes stretched, turning into an hour. Occasionally, doctors and nurses strode by, some casting me curious looks as I lingered against the wall. I texted Nick an update, telling him Zach's father was in ICU. Nick responded immediately. "Need me there? I can come," but I told him to wait. I wasn't sure how long we'd be. Eventually, Zach emerged, his eyes rimmed red. I didn't ask if he'd cried. He was holding himself stiffly, jaw clenched. Without a word, he slumped onto a plastic chair beside. I sat beside him, unsure what to say. "He asked for you," he finally murmured, voice rough. It shocked. My eyebrows lifted. Zach nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. "I told him I'd find you. He's not making much sense. But he said your name." A lump formed in my throat. Part of me wanted to run from this man who'd made my teenage and young adult life miserable. Another part recognized that if he truly was near the end, maybe he needed peace. I placed a hand on Zach's shoulder. "Do you want me to go?" Zach nodded slowly, blinking back tears. "Yeah, maybe he wants to apologize, or I don't know. But if he's asking for you, I think you should." My stomach churned. Inside the ICU room, the lights were dimmed, monitors beeping softly. Mr. Parker lay there, frail and waxy pale, tubes snaking around. His breathing was labored, chest rising and falling unevenly. I stepped closer, heart thudding as I recalled all the times he'd glared at me or hurled insults about my sexuality. He stirred, turning his head, his eyes cracked open, cloudy, but faintly aware. For a moment, I didn't think he recognized me. Then, rasping, he spoke. I forced myself to step to the bedside. "I am here," I managed, voice trembling. "How are you feeling?" A weak, bitter laugh escaped his cracked lips. "Dying, probably." He coughed, a wet sound. "Ain't much left." I looked down, hands twisting nervously. "You wanted..." He inhaled as though it took great effort. "I've been wrong, boy. All those years." My chest tightened. It sounded like an attempt at an apology, albeit a cryptic one. "Mr. Parker," I started. "You need to rest." "Don't." He waved a shaky hand, cutting me off. "No time," he rasped. "I blamed you for things, not your fault. I failed Zach. My fault. Don't blame him." Emotions swelled in my throat. "I never..." He coughed again. "Made his life. Hell, yours too." I was so angry. Afraid. His voice cracked. "He loves you, you know." A harsh pang bloomed in my chest. "Loves me?" That was a complicated statement, especially now. "Maybe once," I whispered. "But Zach has his own life. I do too." Mr. Parker's eyes flickered, breath rattling. "Don't let him drown alone," he managed. Then his gaze skittered away, and he mumbled incoherently, drifting from consciousness. I stood there, pulse roaring in my ears. Outside the corridor, I heard the hum of activity, but in that room, time seemed suspended. For all the pain this man caused me and Zach, his words now held a note of regret, of a father who realized too late how fear had guided his cruelty. A nurse entered, checking the monitors. She gave me a gentle nudge toward the door. Let him rest, I nodded, stepping out. Mr. Parker's rasped words echoing in my mind. Don't let him drown alone. I found Zach pacing the hallway, face taut with worry. When he saw me, he rushed over. What did he say? I exhaled, shaking my head. He apologized, sort of. Said he was wrong about us, about you. Told me not to let you drown alone. Zach's eyes shone with a flicker of tears. He quickly blinked away. That sounds like some final words, he managed. I placed a hand on his arm. He's still hanging on, Zach. Let's not assume the worst. Zach nodded, but I could see the fear in his gaze. We lingered in the hallway, uncertain what came next. Finally, the doctor approached, explaining they'd continue to monitor Mr. Parker. Zach could stay if he wanted, but visiting hours would be limited. I offered to drive Zach back to the motel to gather his things, in case he planned on sleeping in the waiting. While Zach filled out a few forms, I checked my phone. Nick had called and left a voicemail. My heart squeezed. I glanced at Zach, torn. I should update Nick. Do you mind if I step outside? Zach shook his head. Go ahead. Out in the hospital parking lot, the sky was an endless black, pinpricked by scattered stars. I dialed Nick, and he answered on the second. Adam? Everything okay? Yeah. Well, not really. Mr. Parker's in bad shape. I paused, breath fogging in the cool air. He asked to see me, Nick. It was intense. Nick's voice softened. I am sorry. That must have been tough. Are you coming home? I glanced at the glowing hospital windows. I am driving Zach back to the motel so he can grab some clothes. He might stay here overnight. Then I'll head home. I'll probably be late. A pause. Okay. Drive safe. And yeah, emotion prickled behind my eyes. I love you. After hanging up, I stood there a moment, letting the chill wind calm my scattered mind. Then I headed back inside to find Zach waiting, worry etched into every line of his face. Zach and I left the hospital, the ride back to the Willow Inn mostly silent. When we arrived, a figure stood near the motel's office, a petite woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, a single suitcase by her feet. Zach cursed softly under his. It's my mom, he muttered. She must have flown in. Dad must have called her before he took a turn. My eyes flicked between him and the woman. She noticed us, her posture stiffening. Zach climbed out of the truck first, and I followed. Mom? He greeted, voice. She pursed her lips, scanning him. Zachary, I heard about your father. Her gaze shifted to me, curious. And you? I offered a polite nod. Adam, a friend. My voice wavered on that last word, not sure what label. She eyed me, not overtly hostile but reserved. I see. Zach swallowed. Mom, I am sorry. I didn't know you were coming. She drew in a steadying breath. No need to apologize. I want to see Gerald if it's truly that serious. Do you have a place for me to stay? Zach hesitated, glancing at the dingy motel. I can arrange a second room here. Or maybe, why not stay with me? I offered before I could second guess. Nick and I had a small guest. Room nothing fancy, but certainly better than the Willow Inn. I am sure my husband won't mind. Zach's mom raised an eyebrow. Zach cleared his throat. Adam's married. A flicker of understanding passed over her features. If she knew anything about our past, she didn't let it show. If that's not an inconvenience, I suppose it would be nice not to stay in this place. She eyed the motel sign. I forced a smile. Really, it's fine. I need to swing by my house anyway. We can all stop there, get you settled. Zach looked uncomfortable, but gave a tentative nod. If you are sure. Thank you, Adam. It wasn't how I expected the night to go driving Zach and his mother to my house. But life in Bridgewood had a way of twisting unpredictable. Nick was waiting on the couch when we arrived, brow furrowed with concern. He stood as soon as the door opened. I quickly introduced him to Zach's mother, Miss. She offered a polite, if distant, "We appreciate your hospitality," she said, eyes flicking around our modest living. Nick, ever the gracious host, stepped forward. No. You are welcome. The guest room is down the hall. We don't have much, but it's clean and quiet. Miss Parker managed a small smile, fatigue lining her face. Thank you. Let me just freshen up if you don't mind. She took her suitcase and disappeared around the corner, leaving the three of us standing there in awkward silence. Nick surveyed Zach, noticing the dark circles under his eyes. You look beat. We can set up the couch for you, unless you are heading back to the hospital soon. Zach rubbed a hand over his face. I might get a couple hours of sleep, then go back. They said they'd call me if anything changed. Nick nodded, then turned to me. Let's get some blankets. You okay? I exhaled. Just a strange night. But yeah, I am okay. While Zach sank into an armchair, Nick and I ducked into the linen closet, rummaging for spare blankets and pillows. Out of earshot, Nick rested a hand on my shoulder, worry etched into his features. How's Mr. Parker? I shook my head, voice hushed. Not good. This could be the end. He actually apologized to me, in his own. Nick's eyes widened. That must have been intense. It was, I whispered. I still can't believe we have his ex-wife and Zach in our living room. I am sorry this is all happening. Nick smoothed his hand down my arm, a comforting gesture. Hey, we're in this together. I'll make some tea. That might help everyone calm down. I felt a surge of gratitude. We returned to the living room, dropping the blankets on the couch. Zach stood to help arrange them, then slumped back down, exhaustion evident. Meanwhile, Parker emerged from the hallway, her posture slightly softened after washing. I'll let you all rest, I said gently, feeling the lateness of the hour. Tomorrow, we can figure out a schedule for visiting the Nick added. If you need anything in the night, just knock on our door. I am off work tomorrow, so I can even drive you back to see Mr. Parker early if you... Miss Parker nodded, looking unexpectedly grateful.
Thank you, boss.
You are very kind. With that, Nick and I retreated to our bedroom, leaving Zach and his mother to sort out their sleeping arrangements. Once inside, I pressed my back against the door, letting out a long... Nick circled an arm around my waist, pulling me. You okay? I buried my face in his shoulder. I think so. Just a lot to take in. But I am glad we can help. Even if it's awkward. He stroked my hair. We'll get... His calm steadied me. We changed into pajamas, climbed into bed, and Nick turned off the bedside lamp. I lay there in the dark, listening to the faint murmur of voices in the living room. My heart felt heavy with the weight of old wounds, new challenges, and the fragile possibilities that tomorrow might... Morning light crept through the curtains earlier than I would have liked. I blinked groggily at the clock. 6:15 a.m. Nick still slept soundly, his arms slung protectively across my... Carefully, I slid out of bed, not wanting to wake him, and tiptoed into the hall. The door to the guest room was ajar, Miss Parker presumably inside, while the couch in the living room lay empty. My stomach flipped with worry. Had Zach gone to the hospital? I found a note on the kitchen table, scrawled in Zach's handwriting. Went back to the hospital. Will text updates. Thank you again. I set the note down, mind swirling. It seemed Zach was determined to face the day alone. In the quiet of the house, the hum of the refrigerator was oddly loud, and the faint smell of coffee residue lingered in the air. Miss Parker appeared from the hallway, dressed neatly in slacks and a blouse, despite the early hour. She eyed me with polite reserve. Good morning, I said softly. Zach left a note. He's at the hospital, she sighed. I figured. Thank you for letting me stay here. I'll head over soon as well. I assume you or your husband could drive. I forced a small smile. Of course. Once Nick's awake, we can figure it out. She nodded, stepping into the kitchen, glancing at the mostly empty coffee pot on the counter. Mind if I? Go ahead, I said, retrieving fresh grounds from the cupboard. I'll make a new... We worked in silence, the air thick with an unspoken question. Does she know about Zach's and my past? If so, she wasn't bringing it up. Once the coffee started dripping, she cleared her. You and Nick, you seem happy, she ventured carefully. My cheeks warmed. We are. It wasn't always easy, but we've built a life. She pursed her lips. I am glad Zach has supportive people around him. Gerald never quite understood, and I was always caught in the middle. A flicker of regret crossed her face. Not that it's an excuse. Zach said you got divorced before he left Britain, she sighed, looking older in that moment. Gerald and I had different visions of life. We stayed together too long for appearance. By the time we split, Zach was practically grown, but he still resented me for not protecting him from his father's wrath. She paused, shoulders sagged. I just hope he can forgive me some. My chest constricted with empathy. He might. It'll take... She gave a tentative nod, then fell silent as the coffee finished brewing. I poured us each a mug. We sipped quietly, the warm bitterness grounding us in the here and outside. Birds chirped in the early light. Nick's footsteps approached, heralded by a half-stifled yawn. "Morning," he mumbled, hair rumpled. "Everything okay?" We both murmured greetings, and I filled a mug for him too. Miss Parker explained that she wanted to see Gerald as soon as possible. Nick tossed me a questioning glance, and I nodded. "I'll drive her, if that's—" "Of course," Nick said. "I've got some errands later, but I can hold—" She looked between us, faintly surprised. Within the hour, I was guiding Miss Parker down the hospital corridor toward the ICU. A nurse informed us that Mr. Parker's condition was unchanged critical, but stable enough for short visits. Zach was already inside the room, standing by the bed, shoulders. The moment Miss Parker saw him, she rushed forward, placing a hand on his back. He stiffened, then relaxed a fraction, acknowledging her presence. "He's still asleep," he whispered, eyes rimmed red. "Docs say it's a waiting." She nodded, smoothing Zach's hair like he was a little boy again. He didn't. I stood by the doorway, not wanting to intrude on a family moment. My phone buzzed. Nick checking in. I texted him back. "We're at ICU. No changes. I'll keep you posted." Minutes passed in silence. Miss Parker eventually eased into a chair, clasping Mr. Parker's limp hand. Zach stood on the opposite side of the bed, arms folded as though guarding his. I lingered near the door, the quiet beeps of the machines weaving a tense sound. When a nurse came to check vitals, I seized the chance to step out, giving the family some privacy. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, exhaustion pulling at my limbs. How did we get? A month ago, my life had been routine. Teaching, coming home to Nick, planning for the next school term. Now, I was knee-deep in Zach's family crisis. Zach emerged after a while, looking weak. He slid down the wall to sit beside me on the linoleum floor, knees bent. "They're adjusting Dad's medication," he said flatly. "He hasn't woken up." I nodded, sinking down to sit next to him. "I am sorry." Zach shrugged, swallowing hard. "Me too." He dropped his head back against the wall. "You know, as awful as it sounds, I never thought I'd come back for this. Part of me figured I'd never see him again, like I'd be free." I reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It's okay to have complicated feelings, Zach. He put you through a lot." "Yeah," he rasped, blinking fast. "But I still hate seeing him like this." We lapsed into silence, just two people trying to navigate a situation no one could fully prepare for. Miss Parker came out a little later, red-eyed, and we took shifts going in and out of the room. The day bled into afternoon, and soon it was dusk, the hospital windows tinted with orange and pink light. A doctor approached, quietly letting us know that Mr. Parker's condition had deteriorated. They feared he might not last the night unless something drastic changed. We gathered around his bed, Miss Parker holding one hand, Zach the other. I stood behind Zach, a supportive hand on his shoulder. Mr. Parker's eyes flickered open once, a distant haze. Miss Parker murmured soothing words, tears slipping down her cheeks. Zach bit his lip so hard I was surprised it didn't bleed. A strange hush settled over us, the hush of final moments. He drifted again, breath slowing. No grand speeches, no dramatic revelations, just the labored rhythms of a body trying to hold on. Then, around 9 o'clock, a long sigh left his lungs, and the monitors flatlined. Nurses rushed in, but we knew. Zach bowed his head, a harsh sob tearing from him. Miss Parker leaned into him, tears carving silent paths. I felt my own throat tighten, sadness and relief mingling in a confusing swirl. For all Mr. Parker's flaws, death has a way of softening edges, reminding us of our shared humanity. A doctor confirmed what we already knew. They gave us privacy. Zach wept, face pressed to the bed's edge. Miss Parker stroked his hair, tears shining on her cheeks. I remained with them, bearing witness to a complicated love, an imperfect family saying goodbye. The next hours passed in a blur signing forms, meeting with a hospital social worker. Miss Parker talked in hushed tones about funeral arrangements. Zach's eyes were hollow, voice shaky. I offered whatever quiet support I could. At midnight, we finally left the hospital. Miss Parker returned to Nick's and my house, wanting a proper bed to rest her grief. Zach refused to leave the orchard house. He claimed he needed air, needed to walk. Nick understood and stayed behind, while I insisted on guiding Zach home. Zach and I ended up at the orchard behind my place, the cool night wind rustling fallen leaves. A pale moon illuminated the rows of trees, some of them gnarled and half. We walked in silence, side by side, until Zack stopped at a spot thick with memory. "Remember this corner?" he asked, voice raw. "We used to meet here. We carved our initials somewhere." He trailed a hand over the rough bark of a tree. Sure enough, though barely visible, there was a heart with 2 sets of initials, a relic of teenage. I swallowed, reaching out to trace the faint etching. "Yeah, I remember." He pressed his palm flat against it, head bowed. "I am sorry for everything, Adam. For leaving you, for dragging you into my life again now. I wish it could have been different." My eyes burned with unshed tears. "Me too," I whispered. "But I am not sorry we got to say goodbye to your dad. You gave him that chance." Zack sniffed, a shaky laugh escaping him. "He gave me so much grief, but I guess I did still love him. And maybe he loved me, in his messed up way." I slid an arm around his shoulders, pulling him into a side hug. He rested his head against me, sobs quaking through him. For a moment, I held him like that, letting him grieve. Then the rawness of it eased, and he straightened, swiping his sleeve over his eye. "What now?" he asked, voice like a child lost in the dark. I exhaled, glancing toward the faint glow of my house. "You'll figure it out, funeral arrangements, closing out his affairs. If you want to stick around a bit, you can. Or head back to Chicago whenever you are ready." He hesitated, scuffing his shoe against the ground. "Do you think Nick would mind if I crashed on your couch for a few days, until after the funeral?" A ghost of a smile tugged at my lips. "I'll talk to him. I can't promise anything, but I think he'll understand." Zack nodded, relief and sorrow intermingling on his face. Oh, we stood there another moment, listening to the wind in the trees. Then, wordlessly, we turned back toward the house, the orchard behind us like a chapter quietly closed. Epilogue. A season of change. The funeral was small and subdued, held at a modest funeral home on the outskirts of town. Miss Parker and Zack stood together, receiving polite condolences from acquaintances and distant relatives. I attended with Nick by my side. Some people cast quizzical looks at the dynamic in the room: Zack's ex, Zack's mother, Zack's father in a casket. But in the end, the hush of grief overshadowed any rumor. For Zack, it was a final confrontation with his past. He delivered a short eulogy, voice shaking, acknowledging his father's failings but also the good in him. I saw Parker slip an arm through Zack's, tears slipping down her face, and realized they might finally start. In the days after, Zack did crash on our couch. Surprisingly, Nick took it in stride. He and Zack even found occasional moments of camaraderie, discussing sports or sharing a late-night beer. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was at least mutual respect. Eventually, the credit card fraud got sorted, and Zack was cleared of most liability. We all breathed a sigh of relief. Over time, Parker flew home, leaving Zack to handle the last bits of his father's estate. On a crisp Saturday morning, Nick and I accompanied Zack to his father's empty house to box up a few belongings. The place felt haunted by regrets and might have been. Then one day, it was time for Zack to go. Standing by his packed car in our driveway, he extended a hand to Nick. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Forever." Nick shook his hand firmly. "Take care of yourself, Zack." Zack turned to me. "Adam, I don't know how to say goodbye after all this." My throat felt tight. "Then don't. We'll keep in touch. If you need us, call, if you want a place to crash again." I trailed off, glancing at Nick, who nodded in agreement. Zack's eyes brimmed with gratitude. "Yeah, okay. Thank you. Both of you." With that, he climbed into his car, the engine rumbling to life. We waved as he pulled away, dust swirling behind the tires. I felt a pang remnants of old love, old scars, new understanding. Beside me, Nick slipped an arm around my waist. "You okay?" he asked softly. I leaned into him, heart heavy but peaceful. "Yeah, I think I finally..." We stood together, watching the road until Zack's car disappeared behind the orchard's bend. The wind rustled the leaves, carrying away the echoes of past secrets and heart. Bridgewood lay quiet and steady beneath a changing sky, promising that life like the seasons would keep moving forward, whether we were ready or not. Nick and I walked inside, hand in hand, ready to continue our own story, one built on honesty, trust, and the kind of love that stays even when old ghosts try to pull it up. And so, in the hush of a small town settling into autumn, we found a new beginning.